The Arizona sun blazed merciless and unforgiving across the weathered barn, its rays slicing through rotting plank gaps with the precision of heated blades. Inside the suffocating darkness, Maraya pressed her face against rusted iron bars, her breathing shallow and desperate. The metal had carved deep bleeding grooves into her wrists, where shackles bit relentlessly and dried blood crusted her torn buckskin dress. 3 days. 3 endless days since they had dragged her here, chained her in this cage meant for livestock, accusing her of crimes that existed only in Baron Hutchins' twisted imagination. Outside, she could hear their voices, Crag and his bounty hunters laughing as they passed whiskey bottles between calloused hands. Their conversation carried the casual brutality of men who had forgotten the meaning of human decency. One of them kicked at the barn door with deliberate malice, sending dust cascades through splintered wood. Still got some fire burning in her eyes. Came a gravelly voice thick with cruelty. Baron wants that Apache spirit broken completely before we haul her worthless hide to Santa Fe for a proper hanging. Maraya's knuckles turned bone white as she gripped the bars tighter. She would not grant them satisfaction by screaming. Not today. Not ever. Her silence would be her final act of defiance. The cage had become Maraya's entire universe. A cramped space, barely wide enough for her to lie down, constructed from iron bars designed for cattle. Her Apache mother had named her Ayana, meaning eternal blossom. But that sacred name had died alongside her family 15 years earlier, when Baron Hutchins' hired killers had swept through their village with the devastating force of a wildfire. Since that blood-soaked day, she had lived as Maraya, a half-breed drifter, moving constantly between American and Mexican territories, always running, never belonging anywhere. She had survived through wit skill, and her father's ancient teachings, how to track game across sand that revealed no secrets, how to locate water sources where none appeared to exist, how to vanish into landscape contours as completely as morning mist. But survival demanded invisibility, and invisibility guaranteed crushing loneliness. White settlements saw her Apache heritage and turned her away with suspicious glares. Mexican towns noticed her pale eyes and whispered fearful stories about half-breed curses. 3 weeks ago, she had made the fatal mistake of stopping in Copper Ridge for desperately needed supplies. Baron Hutchins controlled everything from the general store to the sheriff's badge. And he had recognized something unmistakable in her features, perhaps the defiant tilt of her chin that reminded him painfully of her father, the Apache chief who had refused to surrender his people's sacred burial grounds for cattle grazing. Hutchins had orchestrated the frame-up. With masterful precision, stolen horses discovered near her campsite planted evidence that pointed directly to her guilt, paid witnesses swearing they had observed her fleeing the scene at dawn. By sundown, Crag's professional bounty hunters had her secured in heavy chains. Now she scratched another vertical mark in the dirt floor using a bent nail pried loose from rotting wood. Day 3. Her tongue felt swollen and parched from severe dehydration, while her stomach cramped with gnawing hunger. They fed her table scraps once daily, treating her exactly as they would a condemned animal awaiting slaughter. The barn door groaned open on rust-eaten hinges, admitting a shaft of amber evening light that made Maraya squint painfully. She expected to see Crag's sneering face or another of his crude subordinates coming to torment her with stale water or moldy bread crusts. Instead, a tall figure stepped inside a stranger she had never encountered before. He moved with the measured, careful pace of someone long accustomed to solitude, his boots making virtually no sound against packed earth. A wide-brimmed hat cast his weathered features in deep shadow, but she could discern lines carved by years of desert wind and difficult living. Across his left cheek ran a jagged scar, speaking of violence survived rather than avoided. The stranger carried a heavy canvas supply sack over one broad shoulder, provisions for Crag's men, she realized with sinking disappointment. He was merely another cog in the grinding machine that would eventually crush her bones to dust. But something made him pause as he lowered the sack to the floor. His head turned deliberately toward her cage, and their eyes met through the dusty gloom. "You're the horse thief they're talking about," he said quietly, though his tone carried no accusation. "I never stole anything in my life." Maraya replied, her voice hoarse from days of enforced silence. "Baron Hutchins is spreading lies to cover his own crimes." The stranger studied her with penetrating pale blue eyes that seemed to perceive far more than surface appearances. Something haunted lurked in his expression, a recognition of shared suffering that made her breath catch involuntarily in her throat. When he spoke again, his words were measured and carefully chosen. "What name do they call you? Does it matter anymore?" She turned away, unwilling to reveal the desperate hope that had flickered to life in her chest. Dead women have no need for names. But he lingered, despite the risk, watching her through iron bars with an intensity that made her skin prickle with unexpected awareness. Outside, Cragg's booming voice carried across the yard, demanding his supply delivery with typical impatience. The stranger retrieved his canvas sack and walked toward the door, but at the threshold, he stopped completely. "Names matter," he said without looking back at her. "Everything matters, especially the things powerful men try to erase." Eli Boone had not spoken to another human being in 3 weeks before encountering Maraya. And now he discovered himself unable to forget either the sound of her voice or the dignified way she had looked directly at him. Not with cowering fear, but with the unbroken pride of someone who refused to surrender her humanity. That night, he rode back to his isolated ranch, through velvet desert darkness, the woman's words echoing persistently in his mind. His small spread occupied a hidden valley 20 miles from Copper Ridge, surrounded by towering red rock formations that glowed with ember-bright intensity in moonlight. The house was little more than a sturdy wooden shack, featuring a stone chimney and covered porch where he could sit watching sunrise paint the desert in brilliant colors. He had constructed it entirely with his own hands after the war ended, seeking absolute silence after years filled with cannon thunder and screaming wounded horses. But tonight, that familiar silence felt oppressive, pressing down on his chest with suffocating weight. As he unsaddled his horse, a leather journal fell from his saddlebag, his brother Thomas's surveyor notes from 15 years earlier. Eli picked it up and read an entry by lamplight. "Met with Chief Red Eagle today. Showed me a golden badge depicting an eagle in flight, symbol of his clan's authority over sacred burial grounds. Baron Hutchins wants these lands surveyed for cattle grazing, but Red Eagle's people have ancestral rights. Told the chief I would never falsify maps for any amount of gold." He seemed relieved, said too many white men speak with forked tongues. The next morning, he rode back to town, carrying a leather pouch containing $200, every cent he had saved from selling cattle and breaking wild horses. He found Cragg outside the saloon, already drunk, despite the early hour, his face flushed red from whiskey and desert heat. "I want to buy the woman's freedom," Eli announced without preamble, his voice steady and determined. Cragg looked up from his half-empty bottle with bloodshot eyes and released a harsh laugh that sounded similar to grinding broken glass. "She ain't for sale, Boone. Baron wants her dancing at rope's end, not playing house with some hermit war veteran. $300, cash money. You could offer me 3,000 silver dollars, and my answer would remain exactly the same." Cragg leaned back in his wooden chair, his hand drifting with practiced ease toward the Colt .45 holstered on his hip. "Now why don't you climb back on that horse and ride home before I decide you're actively interfering with official territorial business?" Eli held his hostile stare for a long, tense moment, then turned and walked away, with apparent defeat. But instead of riding directly home, he circled back through rocky hills and positioned himself where he could observe the barn through field glasses. Through the magnified lenses, he watched Maraya attempting to work loose a wooden splinter from her cage door. She had wrapped strips of cloth around it to form a crude handle and was using it to scrape methodically at the metal lock mechanism. One of Craig's men spotted her escape attempt and flew into violent rage. Eli watched helplessly as they dragged her from the cage and beat her with leather straps until she collapsed unconscious on the dirt floor. The sight sent white-hot fury coursing through his veins, but he forced himself to remain hidden and observe. A direct assault would accomplish nothing except getting them both killed. As he rode away, a detailed plan began forming in his mind. He would need patience, precise timing, and considerable luck. Most importantly, he would need to remember hard-earned lessons from a dozen Civil War battles about when to strike decisively and when to wait for better opportunities. The dust storm came howling out of the northwest with the fury of an enraged god transforming bright day into impenetrable night, while filling the air with stinging particles of sand and pulverized rock. Eli had been monitoring weather patterns for 2 full days, reading ominous signs in restless cloud movements and the nervous pacing of his horses in their corral. Desert storms were violently destructive, but mercifully brief, and they provided perfect cover for men who understood how to move through them. He wrapped a thick bandana around his face and loaded his saddlebags with water containers, ammunition, and medical supplies, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. The ride to Copper Ridge required twice the normal time, his horse picking its way cautiously through the blinding wall of wind-driven sand. By the time he reached the town's outskirts, visibility had dropped to mere yards in any direction. The barn sat in dangerous isolation behind the main buildings, and Eli could observe that Craig's men had taken shelter in the saloon's warmth. Only one guard remained outside, huddled miserably against the barn wall with a whiskey bottle for comfort. The man's head lolled forward, either drunk or sleeping deeply, and the distinction made no difference for Eli's purposes. Eli ground-tied his horse and approached the barn with the stealth of a hunting wolf in the storm. The side door hung loose on corroded hinges, secured only by a simple metal latch. Inside, the air was thick with swirling dust and the acrid smell of fear sweat. Maraya looked up as he entered, her eyes widening with complete disbelief. "You came back for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "I gave my word, even if only to myself." Eli knelt beside the cage and examined the lock with professional assessment. It was old, but solidly constructed, designed more for keeping animals contained than deterring determined people. He produced a steel crowbar from his coat and wedged it carefully against the metal hasp. "This will make noise." The metal shrieked in protest as he applied steady pressure, but the howling storm outside completely swallowed the sound. The lock surrendered with a sharp crack, and the cage door swung open on protesting hinges. Maraya attempted to stand, but stumbled badly, her legs weakened from days of confinement. Eli caught her before she could collapse. "Can you ride through this storm?" he asked with urgent concern. "I can do whatever it takes to escape this place," she replied through gritted teeth, determination blazing in her dark eyes. They were halfway to the door when it exploded inward with tremendous force. One of Craig's men stood silhouetted against the raging storm, his face a mask of surprise and building rage. He reached for his holstered gun, but knocked over a burning lantern in his panicked haste, sending flaming oil spreading rapidly across the straw-covered floor. "Run." Eli shoved Maraya toward the far wall as hungry flames began consuming the dry wooden support beams. The bounty hunter's shots went completely wild in the smoke and confusion. But the fire spread with terrifying speed through the tinder-dry structure. Eli scooped Maraya into his arms and plunged through the side door just as the roof began collapsing in a spectacular shower of sparks and burning debris. They rode hard through the blinding storm until reaching a sheltered ravine in the distant foothills where wind-carved sandstone provided natural protection from the worst weather. Eli constructed a small fire in a natural cave and began tending Maraya's injuries while she drank deeply from his water bottle. Her wrists showed signs of serious infection from the shackles, and dark purple bruises covered her ribs where Craig's men had beaten her systematically. "Why did you risk everything to come for me?" she asked as he cleaned her wounds with whiskey and strips of clean cloth. Because I understand what it means to watch someone innocent die while cowards do nothing to prevent it. The words emerged harder than he had intended, carrying the crushing weight of old guilt and unresolved shame. Maraya studied his scarred face in the dancing firelight, noting the pain that lived permanently in his eyes. You've lost someone close to you, my brother Thomas. Eli's hands stilled on the bandage he was tying around her wrist. He worked as a territorial surveyor, honest as summer daylight. Baron Hutchins offered him gold to falsify survey maps, make it appear that Apache sacred lands belonged to white settlers for cattle grazing. Thomas refused the bribe, absolutely. So Hutchins arranged his murder. Made it appear accidental. Falling horse, they claimed. Broken neck in a remote gorge. Eli's voice remained flat, but his eyes burned with carefully banked fury. I knew better, but I possessed no concrete proof. And I was afraid, fresh back from the war, half crazy from battlefield horrors I'd witnessed. I allowed them to bury him with their lies, and then I ran to hide in the desert. As they spoke, Maraya noticed his saddlebag had come partially open during their escape. Thomas's leather journal had fallen out, its pages scattered by wind. She gathered them carefully, then stopped as she read an entry that made her blood freeze. This is your brother's handwriting, she said slowly. Listen to this. Chief Red Eagle showed me his clan's sacred golden badge today, an eagle in flight, symbol of their authority over these burial grounds. He trusts me to protect his people's rights. But Baron Hutchins grows more threatening each day. He said if I don't falsify the surveys, something unfortunate might happen to me, just as it did to other men who opposed him. The truth hit both of them with devastating force. The massacre that had destroyed Maraya's family, the false surveys that had justified the illegal land seizure, Thomas's calculated murder, they were all interconnected parts of the same web of greed and systematic violence. Red Eagle was your father. Eli whispered, staring at the journal entry that proved his brother had died trying to protect her people. Yes. Maraya's eyes hardened to polished obsidian. But there was pain there too, the agony of betrayal. And you've been carrying evidence of his innocence for 15 years, while my people were hunted as murderers and thieves. I didn't know, Eli said desperately, reaching for her hand. If I had understood the connection, would you have acted sooner? She pulled away from him, her voice rising with accumulated grief and anger. Would you have fought for justice instead of hiding in your comfortable isolation while innocent people died? They sat in charged silence, the weight of missed opportunities and delayed justice hanging between them. Maraya stared into the fire, tears streaming down her cheeks, not just for her murdered family, but for all the lives that might have been saved if someone had possessed the courage to act. You feel betrayed, Eli said quietly. I feel hollow, empty. For 15 years I've carried hatred for faceless killers, and now I discover that evidence of their guilt was sitting in a dead man's journal, unread and ignored. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. How many others have died because good men chose silence over action? I can't change what I failed to do, Eli replied, his voice thick with shame. But I can choose what I do now. We can choose. Maraya looked at him across the firelight, seeing not just his guilt, but his genuine anguish over his brother's death and his own inaction. Slowly, she reached out and touched the journal. Thomas tried to protect my people. He died for that choice. Her voice softened slightly. Maybe carrying his guilt isn't your burden to bear alone anymore. What do you mean? I mean, we've both been running from the same devil all these years. The question is, are we strong enough to face him together? Eli met her eyes across the dancing flames. Together. The storm passed before dawn, leaving the desert air crystalline and sharp. Eli and Maraya were preparing to move deeper into protective terrain when the sound of multiple horses echoed off ravine walls. Cragg's voice carried across the distance, barking detailed orders to his men. Johnson, circle left around those rocks. Smith, take the ridge and cover our advance. Martinez, check. Every cave and crevice, they're hiding somewhere close. They're tracking us. Maraya observed, studying the approaching dust clouds with practiced eyes. The fire covered our trail leaving town, but these stone formations amplify and funnel sound. They know we're somewhere in this area. Eli checked his rifle and counted his remaining ammunition carefully. 40 rounds total. Not nearly enough if they became surrounded. They climbed higher into treacherous terrain, following ancient game trails that twisted between towering cliffs. The landscape was extremely hazardous, loose scree that could trigger deadly landslides, narrow ledges that crumbled under weight, sheer drop-offs disappearing into shadowy depths. Maraya moved with fluid grace, born from a lifetime in this environment. But Eli struggled with his heavier frame and unfamiliarity with the routes. Behind them, the pursuit grew closer. Their movement on the south face, came Johnson's shout. They're heading for Devil's Gorge. A rifle shot cracked behind them, followed by triumphant yelling. They had been spotted. This way. Maraya led him along a precarious ledge, hugging the cliffside. Far below them, mounted riders scrambled up the steep slope, their horses laboring in the thin mountain air. A bullet struck stone inches from Eli's head, filling his eyes with stinging rock fragments. He turned and returned fire, his Winchester bucking against his shoulder. Johnson tumbled from his horse with a scream, but Smith and Martinez kept advancing relentlessly. Too many enemies, too little ammunition. They reached a wider shelf of rock just as Eli felt fire lance through his left thigh. He stumbled badly, his leg going completely numb, and nearly pitched over the cliff edge before Maraya caught his arm. "How serious is the wound?" she asked, helping him find cover behind a large boulder. Eli examined the spreading crimson stain on his pants. The bullet had passed clean through, but blood loss was becoming a serious concern. "Bad enough. You should go ahead without me. I'll hold them off as long as possible." "Absolutely not." Maraya tore strips from her buckskin dress and began binding the wound with efficient skill. "We discussed this already. We face this together." As she worked, dark clouds began gathering overhead with ominous speed. Maraya glanced up with recognition and growing alarm. "Flash flood coming," she said urgently. "Can you feel the pressure change in the air?" "How long do we have?" "Minutes, maybe less. Desert storms move fast, and this gorge will funnel everything straight down through here." She finished tying the bandage and helped him to his feet. "We need higher ground immediately." But their pursuers were closing in rapidly. Smith appeared on the opposite ridge, his rifle trained on their position. "Surrender now, or we'll drag your bodies back to town." The first drops of rain began falling, fat, heavy drops that struck the stone with surprising force. Within seconds, it became a downpour of biblical proportions. The dry creek bed below them began filling with frightening speed as runoff cascaded down from higher elevations. "Martinez is down," Smith shouted through the rain. Water took his horse. Eli risked a glance over their boulder and saw one of their pursuers being swept away by the rapidly rising torrent. But the flood was climbing toward their position as well, and they were trapped between rising water and enemy gunfire. "There," Maraya pointed to a narrow crevice in the cliffside above them. "We can climb to safety, but we'll be exposed to their shots." "No choice. Move." They scrambled up the slippery rock face as bullets whined around them. Halfway to safety, Maraya's foot slipped on wet stone. She grabbed desperately for a handhold, her fingers finding only loose gravel that gave way under her weight. For a terrifying moment, she hung suspended over a 100-foot drop into the raging floodwater below. "Eli!" she screamed as her grip began failing. He reached down and caught her wrist just as her fingers lost their hold on the cliff face. The sudden weight nearly pulled him over the edge as well, but he managed to brace his feet against solid rock and haul her up to safety. "Don't you ever scare me again?" he gasped, pulling her into the protective crevice. Below them, the flood continued rising with destructive fury. Smith's voice echoed off the stone walls, increasingly desperate. Fall back! Fall back! The water's too high!" They spent the next 3 harrowing days playing a deadly game of predator and prey through the labyrinthine terrain. Their water supply had been contaminated during the flood, forcing them to drink from questionable sources that left them both weakened and sick. Maraya's intimate knowledge of the land kept them alive, and she knew which desert plants could provide both nourishment and medicine, how to read weather patterns for approaching danger, how to find temporary shelter in hidden caves and overhangs. When Eli's leg wound became severely infected, she prepared healing poultices from desert sage and barrel cactus pulp that drew out the poison and reduced his dangerous fever. But their pursuers never gave them time to rest properly. "We can't keep running forever," Eli said during a brief rest in an abandoned homestead. The skeletal remains of a house and barn spoke of dreams that had died in the harsh desert climate. "Then we make our stand," Maraya replied, checking his wound with growing concern. The infection was spreading despite her treatments. "Where they know this country almost as well as you do now." Maraya studied the terrain ahead through his field glasses. "Devil's Canyon. It's a box gorge with high walls on 3 sides. Normally that would be a death trap, but if we can position ourselves correctly and time it right..." "What do you have in mind?" She outlined her plan as they moved deeper into the twisting stone formations. It was risky. Everything depended on precise timing and their enemies' predictable reactions. But it was their only chance of ending this pursuit permanently. The final confrontation arrived with the rising sun in Devil's Canyon, a narrow gorge where towering red sandstone walls rose with cathedral-like majesty on either side. Eli and Maraya had been forced into this natural dead end by Crag's relentless 3-day pursuit, and now they faced their enemies with the blazing morning sun positioned at their backs. Crag sat his lathered horse at the gorge mouth, flanked by Smith and the 2 remaining members of his gang. His face showed severe blistering from the barn fire, and his eyes held the cold gleam of a man pushed far beyond reason by days of futile hunting through hostile terrain. "End of the trail," he called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls with mocking resonance. "Come down peaceful-like, and maybe I'll make the woman's death quick and merciful." "Much counteroffer." Eli shouted back, his rifle trained steadily on Crag's chest, despite the growing weakness in his arms. "You ride away right now, and maybe some of you live to see another sunrise." Crag's laughter rang harsh as a buzzard's cry through the gorge. "You're outnumbered 4-to-1, cripple, and that half-breed bitch ain't worth dying for." Smith spurred his horse forward, confident in their numerical advantage. "Boss says you killed Johnson back at the flood. That makes this personal now." What followed was the most intense and brutal 20 minutes of combat either Eli or Maraya had ever experienced. The battle began when Maraya triggered the avalanche she had spent hours preparing, sending boulders the size of wagon wheels tumbling down with bone-crushing force. Smith was instantly crushed beneath tons of stone, his horse screaming in terror as it fled toward the gorge walls. The remaining men scattered for cover as Eli opened fire. His shots methodical and devastatingly accurate, despite his wounded leg and weakened condition. But ammunition was running critically low. He had perhaps 8 rounds remaining. 6 shots left. Eli called to Maraya as he ducked behind their rocky barricade. "No, make them count," she replied, fitting a sharp stone into the makeshift sling she had constructed from leather strips. Her first stone struck one of Crag's men in the forehead, dropping him instantly. But Crag and his last companion had separated using the smoke and dust clouds to flank their position from opposite sides. "Rodriguez, keep them pinned down," Crag shouted. "I'm going around back." Rodriguez opened fire with a repeating rifle, forcing Eli and Maraya to keep their heads down as bullets chipped stone all around them. Meanwhile, Crag was scaling the gorge wall with the agility of a man fighting for his life. "He's above us." Maraya warned spotting movement on the rim. Eli spun and fired twice at the shadowy figure, but his shots went wide. In return, Crag's bullet burned a furrow across Eli's shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the rocks. "Now you're done." Crag roared triumphantly, rising to his full height on the canyon rim. "Drop your weapons and come out, or I'll put the next shot through the woman's head." With no ammunition left and Eli wounded, they appeared to be at Crag's mercy. But Maraya had been watching the weather signs, and she knew what was coming. Dark clouds had been building all morning, and the air pressure had that distinctive feel that preceded violent desert storms. "You were there," Maraya said loudly, and something in her voice made both men freeze completely. "At the massacre 15 years ago. I remember your voice now. You were laughing while my mother burned alive." Crag's grin was ugly and triumphant. "Damn right I was there. Best day's work I ever did cleaning out that nest of savages. Should have made certain we got all the little whelps too, but you slippery breeds are hard to kill permanent like." The words hit Maraya with the force of physical blows, but they also confirmed what she had long suspected. This man had personally participated in her family's murder. Justice would be served today, one way or another. "My name," she said quietly, rising to her full height with regal dignity, "is Ayanna, daughter of Red Eagle, granddaughter of Winter Moon, and you murdered my entire family in cold blood. I'll murder you too, just the same way Maraya moved faster than striking lightning, but not toward Crag. Instead, she dove toward Rodriguez, who had been so focused on the conversation that he had lowered his guard momentarily. Her improvised knife found his throat before he could react, and she rolled away with his rifle as his body collapsed. Crag fired at her, but his shot went wide as the first clap of thunder rolled across the desert. The storm Maraya had been expecting finally arrived, with devastating fury. Rain began falling in sheets, turning the dry gorge floor treacherous and slippery. "You think that changes anything?" Crag snarled, reloading his revolver with mechanical precision. "I've got 6 shots, and you've got nowhere to run." But Eli had recovered his fallen rifle, and the magazine still held 2 rounds. As Crag raised his weapon to fire at Maraya, Eli's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him stumbling dangerously close to the gorge edge. "No!" Crag screamed, windmilling his arms to keep from falling. For a moment he teetered on the brink, then his boot found purchase on solid stone. The reprieve was temporary. As rain continued falling with increasing intensity, it began triggering rock slides from the unstable walls above. Chunks of sandstone the size of mill wheels came crashing down, forcing all 3 survivors to seek whatever shelter they could find. "The whole gorge is coming down," Eli shouted above the thunder and falling rocks. Maraya spotted a narrow ledge that would provide temporary safety, but reaching it would require climbing directly past Crag's position. There was no other choice: stay here and be crushed by falling stone, or risk everything on a desperate gambit. "Cover me," she called to Eli, then sprinted across the open ground toward the cliff face. Crag saw her coming and raised his gun, but Eli's final bullet caught him in the leg and spoiled his aim. Maraya reached the base of the cliff and began climbing with desperate speed, her fingers finding holds in the rough stone. Halfway to safety, disaster struck. A section of the ledge she was climbing gave way under her weight, and suddenly she was hanging by her fingertips over a drop that would certainly kill her. Below, the gorge floor had become a raging torrent as flash floodwaters poured down from higher elevations. Eli screamed, seeing her predicament. Without hesitation, he pulled a coiled rope from his pack, part of his military gear that he had carried through the war and never discarded. One end he tied around his waist, the other he flung up to her with all his remaining strength. "Grab the rope." She caught it just as her grip on the stone finally failed completely. The sudden jerk as the rope caught her weight nearly pulled Eli over the edge as well. but he managed to brace himself against a boulder and begin hauling her to safety. That was when Crag made his move. Seeing both his enemies vulnerable and exposed, he raised his revolver with grim determination. His shoulder wound made aiming difficult, but at this range, he could hardly miss. "Say goodbye," he roared above the storm. The confession poured out of him, then driven by pain and fury, and the certain knowledge that he was about to complete his revenge. "The Baron paid us $50 for every Apache we killed." He screamed as rain lashed his face. "Your father was worth 100 because he was the chief. We burned them all alive and took their scalps to prove it." Every word was a nail in his own coffin. But Crag was beyond caring about consequences. He had one shot left, and he was going to use it to finish what he had started 15 years earlier. But justice comes in many forms. As he steadied his aim at Maraya's dangling form, a massive section of the gorge wall broke loose directly above him. Tons of sandstone came thundering down, with the force of divine retribution, burying Crag beneath an avalanche of stone, and ending his life in the same violent manner he had brought to so many others. Eli hauled Maraya to safety, just as the main rock slide sealed off both ends of the gorge, trapping the flood waters and creating a temporary lake in what had been the battleground. They collapsed together on a secure ledge, both wounded and exhausted, but alive. "It's over." Eli gasped, his infected leg wound bleeding freely again. No," Maraya replied, binding his injuries with strips torn from her dress. "Now justice begins." The smoke and dust from the rock slide could be seen for 50 miles, drawing lawmen and curious townspeople from across the territory. By the time rescue parties reached the gorge, they found Crag's body partially buried, but his final confession had been overheard by Rodriguez, who survived long enough to repeat every damning word to Sheriff Morrison from the territorial capital. Morrison had been tracking reports of Baron Hutchins' illegal activities for months, but he had never been able to locate witnesses willing to testify. Now he had a dying man's confession, corroborated by physical evidence, and the testimony of 2 survivors who could provide detailed accounts of the Baron's criminal enterprise. Word spread through Copper Ridge with the speed of wildfire. People who had lived in terror for decades suddenly found their voices stepping forward with stories of extortion violence and theft that painted a comprehensive picture of systemic corruption. Hutchins' carefully constructed empire of intimidation crumbled in a single day as the truth finally emerged into daylight. 4 months later, Eli stood on his front porch, watching Maraya work with a young Mustang in the rebuilt corral. She moved with the same patient grace she had shown while tending his wounds, earning the horse's trust through gentle persistence rather than force. The animal's initial fear had gradually given way to curiosity, then acceptance. "Ayana," he called using the sacred name she had reclaimed along with her freedom. Rider approaching from the east, she looked up, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. The approaching horseman wore a deputy's badge and carried official documents in his saddlebags. When he dismounted, his expression was respectful, but grave. "Ma'am, sir, I bring word from the territorial court in Santa Fe. Baron Hutchins was convicted on all charges, sentenced to hang next month." Eli nodded with satisfaction. "What about the others? Most of his gang are dead or scattered. But the evidence you provided helped us round up his business partners in 3 other territories. Turns out this corruption went much deeper than anyone realized." The deputy handed Maraya a leather folder sealed with the territorial seal. "These are the original deeds to your family's ancestral lands. The territorial governor is returning them to you with the government's formal apologies for the injustices done to your people." Maraya opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were maps and documents bearing official seals legally restoring thousands of acres that had been stolen 15 years earlier. More than land, they represented official recognition of her family's rightful place in this territory. There's also a commission being formed to address similar injustices throughout the region. The deputy continued. They want to offer you a position, ma'am. Your knowledge of tribal territories and experience with these crimes would be invaluable in helping other families reclaim what was stolen from them. As the deputy departed, they sat together on the porch steps, watching sunset paint the desert sky in brilliant colors. The Mustang Maraya had been training, stood quietly in the corral, no longer fighting the rope that connected it to the post. You'll take the commission position, Eli said. 3 days a month in Santa Fe. That leaves 27 days to help you build our sanctuary here. She leaned against his shoulder. Together. In the distance, 2 figures appeared on the horizon, refugees seeking shelter just as they themselves had once been. This would be their life now, providing haven for those who had nowhere else to turn, ensuring that what had happened to them would not happen to others. The chains that had bound them, both chains forged from guilt, fear, and hatred, lay broken in the ruins of Devil's Canyon. In their place grew something entirely new, hope as enduring as the desert itself. They were free. They had found their purpose, and they would never be alone again.